Clients ask all the time, why should I have a handbook? And while there's no federal or state regulation that requires a handbook, having a handbook really provides information about your company and what makes your company great and what you expect out of employees, and kind of provides a lot of information to employees in a kind of compact manual. And over the years, we've seen so many changes with handbooks, from very dry, here's a bunch of policies stapled together, to very interactive online handbooks that we see with like some really big name companies. They're online, you can go in and you can look at them, they're interactive. So we really do see the gamut of what employers are using for handbooks as a way to communicate multiple things about their business practices, their company mission, their goals, to provide information about federal and state regulations that they have to comply with, and the policies that the company abides by and expects employees to abide by. Also to provide information about benefits that are offered, time off, healthcare, things like that. Also to set expectations for employee performance and behavior. So these are a lot of things that will be included in handbooks to kind of set the standard and have that open dialogue in a way, and really just answer a lot of questions so employees are not constantly asking a supervisor or HR or the owner, depending on how big your business is, well, how do we do such and such? Well, what's our stance on such and such? Well, it's all there in the handbook. It's all there in the manual. So that's a really great reason to establish a company handbook and have one out there. Again, while there are not federal requirements on having a handbook, there are a lot of regulations and laws at the federal, state, and even local level that employers are required to provide notice to employees about. So for a lot of employers, besides having the mandated posters that you need to be posting, having a handbook that also addresses a lot of these are really, really helpful. And there's a lot of things that you can have in your handbook. So what do you have in your handbook? Again, having an about us, our history, our vision, our mission statement. Those are great things to have in the handbook that lays out things about your company. You may include information about your corporate mission or philosophy, what you stand for. Other things would be defining the employee relationship. Most states have an at-will doctrine or at-will philosophy, and including that statement that the employee is at will is really helpful to clarify that the handbook is not a contract of any kind, which can be a problem. We'll talk about that a little bit later. To have in your handbook that clearly defines that. You'll also maybe want to define and clarify what you consider full-time or part-time, as those definitions are a little bit more fluid. With certain exceptions, such as the Affordable Care Act. But for a lot of times, the company can define what they consider full-time, what they consider part-time, and if there are certain policies or benefits that apply and how those apply. So you can define that. You want to have good information on, following other federal regulations like exempt or non-exempt positions, and you can lay all of that out in your handbook. It's also good to provide notices of certain rights and responsibilities, federal and state and local regulations that may apply to you. So that would have things like maybe if you're covered by Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, if you are a larger employee of 50 employees or more, if you're covered by the Family and Medical Leave Act or FMLA, you may include something on your COBRA rights notification for employees that have healthcare. You might have information about OSHA, occupational health and safety, how to report workplace accidents, details on harassment policies and things like that. Those are really good things to include in your handbook. And there are lots of sample policies out there, and there's, even within some of these policies that or federal regulations that have very, defined parameters, there are room for you to work within that parameters on how your particular company wants to handle things. So there's a lot of flexibility when you're building a handbook to what to include, what you need to include, and how you're going to operate within those requirements. One of the other things that you'll include are going to be your benefits, your perks, all the little things that you want to use to entice employees to you. So information on your health insurance and other benefits like that. And again, this is usually just an overview. We always want to refer back to the summary plan of description on the details, because those can change a lot from year to year, and you may not necessarily want to be making updates all the time. So generally having an overview of your benefits package. If you have vacation, sick time, PTO or paid time off policy, that's where you can really define how the policy works, what's included in it, how much time people get off. It's really important to have these clearly defined, especially if you're operating in multiple states or looking at what your state specifically requires. For example, Arkansas and Oklahoma don't necessarily have a requirement, or they have some more loosely defined requirements. And a lot of it is, if you don't have to offer a paid time off, a vacation policy, but if you do, you need to define it. And if you don't have it defined, it's going to go off on your policies or your practices and past ways that you've handled things. So having a clearly defined policy that says you get 1 week of vacation after so many years of service, and then 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks, and then 4 weeks, and how you do a payout or how you do a sale back, that's very clearly defined and you can apply equally to everyone, is really helpful versus saying, well, we'll pay it out at our discretion, because then it kind of has an opportunity to look like, well, are you being discriminatory in who you opt to pay back? And that is something that Department of Labor and Wage and Hour and other agencies are looking at to make sure that you're being consistent and fair in all of your practices. So having a clearly defined policy in your handbook helps with that. Also, with a handbook, you can set expectations for employee behavior and performance, conduct expectations, having a very clearly defined company standards of behavior, defining what is theft, defining what is time theft, defining your attendance policy, how much time is tardy, what are excessive absences, who is the employee supposed to contact? Is the office manager or receptionist the main point of contact, or should each employee be contacting their direct supervisor or another supervisor? Or do you have an attendance call-out line that some employers have, that you call this 1-800 hotline number and you tell them what's going on? Having things like that is really helpful for many reasons. It sets the standard for all employees. Having maybe a clearly defined disciplinary action policy, how we're going to address performance issues. Are you going to do a coaching first, a verbal warning, a written warning, a second written warning, a final written warning? Do you do suspension? Is suspension, how long of a suspension? What are all the steps that you take before you have termination? Having these can really, number one, hold all your managers and all your employees accountable to following a very specific process. And again, being consistent. Consistency is key. And also making sure you're not, I don't want to say skipping steps, because there are certain situations where you can escalate corrective action or disciplinary action. But generally you want to be doing kind of the same level and the same process of things for all of your employees. And having these standards of conduct set in your handbook means that everybody knows what you're looking at. It's important to make sure that your handbooks are written in language that's easy to understand. And sometimes you do get policies, especially when you've got state or local mandated policies for, maybe sick time. There are several states that have introduced mandated paid sick time. And sometimes those can get a little bit wordy because you really want to make sure you're capturing the nuance and the requirements of the policy. But generally you want it to be easily readable. You want people to be able to understand it. You want it to be really clear and concise. For example, for vacation policies, sometimes a nice little chart is really great. Especially try to keep your policies simple. It's going to be easier for you to manage as an employer, especially if you have like a timekeeping tracking system that will automate your timekeeping and your time off policies. You want your people to be able to understand it. You want it to be really clear. The more complicated you make it with, prorated this and back pay this, and we do vacation this way and this way, the more complicated it gets, the more questions you have, the more likely people are not going to understand it, be confused, be asking a lot of questions. It's harder to manage. So keeping things clear and streamlined is really, really helpful. One thing that we get asked a lot, or I've been asked several times in the past, is our handbook confidential information? Is our handbook proprietary? And as I mentioned, with all the new ways that we're seeing handbooks, is that not really. I mean, you could, in some cases, make an argument that maybe a handbook is proprietary, but because you welcome your new employee, Donnie, in, and you give Donnie a copy of the handbook and say, Donnie, this is yours, you can reference it, you can look at it, we want you to be familiar with it, and Donnie takes it home, it's out of your hands now. So really you want to have general overviews of your policies, because the handbooks are going to get out, employees are going to have them, they're going to look at them. As I said, there's some companies that even put handbooks online. So where that distinction is you have a handbook that generally has policies and a few simple procedures, like when you're asking for time off or when you're calling in because you're out sick or you're going to be late. And then you have a standard operating procedure or an SOP manual. And that's where you're going to have that more detailed information on, this is how we run such and such report. This is how we manufacture such and such process. And that's usually your in-house documents that would or could have proprietary information. Again, and some of this is legal, so this is not legal advice, but kind of a general overview. Those are generally your more in-house documents that step by step tell out a process and maybe who the vendor is or how you very specifically manufactured or developed something. And so that's kind of where that line is on what's a confidential proprietary document and what is not, and where handbooks and operating procedures fall in that. So be careful with that. We do see clients and other businesses that kind of smash them all together. Sometimes that's a very large document. So just be careful, look at what is a best practice and what works for your business the best. So some other things that you might want to include in your handbook. I think I mentioned earlier an at-will employment disclaimer, which again talks about the at-will status of the employee. Most states have an at-will doctrine, and you can relay that in your handbook. It's really good to have mentioned in there. You'll also want to have maybe a contract disclaimer if you have any, that the handbook's not a contract. You'll want to have an acknowledgement form that says, I, employee name, have received this handbook. I will read it. I will abide by the policies. It's really useful to have maybe a last revised date or a current version date that's maybe on the footer of all the handbook pages of all the policies and the acknowledgement form, just so, the employee that's signing it is signing for the most current handbook, and then you want new employees and any updates to all be signed. Some of the policies that we really do see a lot of practices would include things like an equal employment opportunity statement, an FMLA policy if you're large enough to be covered under FMLA. If you're not, does your state require some kind of FMLA mirroring policy that maybe applies to smaller employers? Or do you as an employer want to have a policy that you have in place to assist employees when they're having some kind of surgery, or if they're going on parental leave because they're having a baby or adopting a child? In some situations, your Americans with Disabilities requirements may come into play, but even within that, you can still have a policy to say we allow for personal and medical leaves of absence, and have an outline for how you want to do that. Policies about military leave, what's your policy for jury duty, witness duty, school time off if that's something you need to have. Maybe a COBRA policy that explains what you do when somebody leaves and they need to apply for COBRA. A policy on electronic devices, company provided cell phones, laptops, personal devices. If you have a bring your own device policy that employers are going to have personal information and company information on their own personal device, how are you going to handle that? A policy on smoking or tobacco use or other substance use. If you're going to allow maybe drinking at workplace events, how you handle your timekeeping, what's the punch clock system? Do you have an app on people's phones or computers that they can use, and how do they use it? Or do you have maybe something that uses a thumbprint, different ways that you're going to do your timekeeping? What are the hours of work? What's your standard business hours? What are your options for meal and break periods? Do you have minors that you employ? Do they have special break periods? Things like that. Things on overtime, mandatory pay, if you have a lot of salaried exempt employees, a safe harbor policy on how that works. Non-inclusive list of conduct expectations, what is absolutely out of line, such as theft of company property, of client or vendor property, violence in the workplace, things like that. Policy on drug and alcohol use and testing, medical marijuana and even recreational marijuana is becoming more and more prevalent. So what are your stances on that? Having a really good tight policy on how you do drug testing and what you're looking at for employees being under the influence of things on the job site. Maybe a code of ethics might be something that you want to include. That's highly recommended on just employee behavior, and not just employee behavior too, but like managerial behavior. This doesn't just apply to your rank and file. This should apply to every level of business. And you want to have your managers exhibiting and even modeling the kind of behavior that you want from your employees, because it comes from the top. If you want good behavior, it has to come from the top. So you really need to train your manager to follow these policies, enforce the policies. There are so many policies. We could have pages and pages of policies that you might want to include, but it really is going to come down to your specific industry and needs. So these can really be customized, but there are a lot of, good standard policies that you do want to kind of look at and have in place. So to wrap it up, kind of when we're wrapping everything up and looking at it, is where are your legal concerns, where are things that could go wrong with having your handbook or having things in your handbook that maybe shouldn't be in there. Just as a disclaimer, anything that's illegal, you shouldn't include. It's really common to think that you can have a policy that tells employees not to talk about their wages. That's in violation of the National Labor Relations Board or National Labor Relations Act. Employees can talk about wages and benefits. So don't have a policy in the handbook that says you can't, because that's bad. But other things that are problematic is using a certain kind of language to maybe say guarantee a job, because that then makes your handbook look more like an employee contract. So as much as you want to evoke feeling like a family, be really careful to say things like welcome to the family, or you're going to have a job here as long as you can do such and such. So because maybe they won't have a job there. You don't necessarily know. Heaven forbid that something bad happens, but you never know what the future is going to hold. So be really careful about that kind of language, because that can create legal obligations. Be careful about what policies you do include and have things lined out. For example, we mentioned FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act. Make sure to include that only if you're covered. If you're not a covered employer, or if you have a change in your status from a covered employer to a non-covered employer or vice versa, and your handbook needs to be updated. There have been court cases where an employee said, well, it was in the handbook, so I should have access to this, but that employer wasn't necessarily covered, but they did include it in the handbook, or maybe they had lost coverage, the eligibility status, but didn't remove it from the handbook. So be careful in having those things in there and using really clear language. Another thing is when you have those policies and procedures and they're not being followed accurately. So having your managers know, being consistent. If you're going to write Janie up for being tardy 3 times, you need to write Joseph up for being tardy 3 times. If you're going to look at Stanley's attendance issues or Stanley being violent in the workplace, you need to do the same thing for Stephanie or whoever it is. You don't want to pick and choose when you apply your policies, when you apply your disciplinary actions. You want to be really consistent. So, if you're having a big change to how you're doing things internally, or if there is an update to a state or federal or local regulation like the sick time, you want to make sure you're updating your handbook so that you're actually following those regulations. You're actually following the policies that you have in the handbook. So it's really important to, maybe about every year or so, go back and look at your things. Or if you get an update that such and such state has added something and you need to do an update for your handbook, that you get those updated. So if you have a handbook that needs a review, if you don't have a handbook and don't know where to start, we can absolutely help you, talk to you, see what you need, and help devise and develop a handbook that works for your business, for your company, for your employees. So please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help.